So part 14, let's move on. So we're on the mix form still, and we need to work on the code behind the create button. Now this is going to be the largest bit of code that's created for a sort of single control in the whole database, and the most complicated because there's quite a lot of stuff going on here. So I'm going to try and break this down into, well, as many little videos as it takes, or reasonably sized videos. And yeah, so let's move ahead and start looking at the functionality. So the first thing that we want to do when we hit this create button is we want to sanity check the volume. So if we have a look in here, basically, let's close that. Let's open make a mix. So we can see that it starts off at 0. Now, obviously we can't create a mix with a 0 volume, 0 milliliters or 0 liters or whatever it is you happen to be wanting to mix. So we need to check that that's set to something sensible. Now, already programmed into Access is the fact that it knows it's a number, so we can't type in, say, a few letters because it's going to spit out an error. But if we put in 0 or -2, it kind of will let us do that, and we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that this is a positive value before we hit the create button, or as we hit the create button. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to take that back off. Oh dear, let's put it into 0. That'll do for now. And go into the design view. Let's click on the create button and let's make an on-click handler. So we will decide what happens when we click that button. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some code to check that the value is sensible. And there it is. So basically it's just an if statement that says if the mix volume value, which is that box there, when we've clicked the create button, is less than or equal to 0, then it's basically just going to pop up a little message box saying enter the volume first, and then it's going to bounce out and do nothing else. So that's great. Let's close that and let's do a little bit of testing. Let's close this, save it, make a mix. Let's say leave it at 0, click the create button. There you go. Little box pops up, enter volume first, and we can continue and set this as we should. That's good. So the next thing we're going to do is go back into the design view and into the click handler code. And we will want to add a few variables to get us going here. For example, we will want to take that value that's in the mix volume field and assign it to a variable, because we're going to use it quite a lot as this subroutine expands on down here. The other thing we want to do is to grab hold of the mix ID. So I'm going to add a bit of code into here now and come back and see what that does. Right, so here, the first thing I've done is I've defined a couple of variables at the top. There's a variable called total vol, and that is of a single type, i.e. it has a decimal point or has the ability to have a decimal point. And the other variable that is defined is this mix ID, which is an integer. So what happens is there's a little bit we did already. Down here, what it's going to do is it's going to go and grab whatever's in the mix ID field box. Now I'll show you why that's important. Basically, if we close this and save it and run it again, what you'll see as soon as we add something into the volume, let's say 200, you'll see that the mix ID automatically gets assigned by Access. It's just increments, takes the next available integer upwards. So the next one, for example, will be 8. And it gives it this, and this is our unique ID that we are referring to this mix, and we need to assign that to a variable also because we're going to use it quite a lot. We need to save all of the ingredients with the same mix ID so that they're associated together. So those are the two things we're going to assign to variables: the amount that we put in the volume here and what's being created by the database. So looking at the old design view again and the on-click handler for the create button, you can see that's exactly what I've done. This mix ID is the value that's in the mix ID field. Total volume is the value that's in the mix volume field. Then, just so that we can't keep creating the create button, clicking the create button, because that would be a bit pointless, we disable it basically. So let's see what comes next in our notes. We have done the sanity checking. We now need to gather all of the recipe data, and it comes from two places because the recipe is stored in two tables, the recipe table and the recipe ingredients table. So we need to go and gather all of the information relating to that recipe and put it into some more variables, probably, and arrays and all sorts of things, so that we can manipulate it. So if we have a look at what we've got here, and let's close this and save it. So this is the information that we need. We need to get nearly all of this, really. We need the name, we need the nick percentage, VG, PG, we need the ingredients and their percentages. So when we click the create button, it's going to have to gather all of that information in, and it knows which recipe to get, because if you remember, we've attached some arguments that when we click this button, this form is open with some arguments, and we already stuck in up here the important argument we want, which is the recipe ID. So we'll basically take that recipe ID, go and look up in the database all of these details so that we can work with them and figure out how much of each ingredient we need to use. So I'm going to start adding that data now. So here we go. I've defined a few more variables that we're going to need. No point in discussing those right now. They're just definitions, but we'll go through what I've done a little bit further down here. So there's the little pop-up we did. There's what we did earlier with assigning the mix ID and mix volume to variables. And here's what I've added here. So basically what we've got, and I've added lots of notes. I'm going to be adding lots of comments on this code, because when I come back to it maybe in the future, I'm kind of going to need clues to know what it all is. So basically we've got the mix recipe name value is being looked up from the database. So as you know, we've got this global RID, which is our recipe ID, which we brought over when we opened the form, and we've already assigned to this global variable, global RID. So we can go and look up in the recipes table the recipe name that relates to that recipe ID and assign it to, basically in this case we're assigning it directly to the value, the field, i.e. that field there, from the database. And that's that's going to fill in the recipe ID for us. The recipe name. We are then assigning to some new variables the mix VG, i.e. what the VG percentage is, and that's doing exactly the same thing. It's just looking it up from the recipes table based on the recipe ID passed across. Same for VG and the same for the nicotine percentage we're looking for. We then fill out this field down here, wherever it is, the mix VG PG. We fill in by combining the values mix VG and mix PG and just sticking a slash in the middle of them. We then fill out the mix nick target value, which is that box there, with the value that we got from the database here. So that fills basically all the information we need from the actual recipes table. Now we need to grab the recipe ingredients data. So rather than doing that with the single lookups like I did here, which I could have done via SQL as well, but I didn't. I just used the dlookup command. So down here I've now started to use a record set, and the record set runs off of this SQL query even. So it's selecting the recipe ingredient ID, the recipe ingredient name, the recipe ingredient percentage, which is basically all we need for the recipe ingredients, from the recipe ingredients table, where the recipe ingredient recipe ID is the one that was passed across, our global RID. We then basically open up record set, and then we start working with some arrays. Now those arrays have been defined up here but don't have a size, and in VBA sizing of arrays basically needs to be done explicitly. So at this point in time, whilst we're looping through all of these ingredients that are returned, we don't necessarily know if we're working on the first one, the third one, or the last one, if that happens to be different. So we need to check the size of the array and resize it accordingly. So in the first block here, basically what I'm doing is I'm saying if the array, and we've got how many arrays? We've got 4 arrays going on. We've got mix ingredient ID, so that's going to store all the IDs for the ingredients. The next array is going to store all the names, the next array is going to store all the percentage, and the next array is going to store all of the volumes. So basically, yeah, what I'm doing is I'm saying if the array is currently empty, then we know that we're going to be storing these in the first elements of the array. So they're all set to 0 and the array index is set to 0. Array index is just a variable I've created so that I can specify, after I've worked out here what the index is, exactly where to stick things in, and we'll use that a little bit later on. If it isn't, if let's say this array, and these arrays are always going to be of the same size and the index is always going to be pointing in the same place because this data is basically referring to the same ingredient. So yeah, the position of the index in the arrays are going to be the same for each, which is why I only really need to specify the mix ingredient ID array to test to see if it's empty. If it's not empty, then basically what we'll do is we'll change the size of the array. And by doing that here, we've got the array index is the current size of the mix ingredient ID array plus 1. So we're adding 1 to the size of the array, making it 1 bigger. And then we are then actually carrying that out on each of those arrays there. So here is where we calculate it and we assign that to array index. So the first time through it would be 0 and it would be dealt with here. Second time through there would be something in the array, so it would go, okay, there's something in it. Let's increase it by 1 and let's take that new value and assign that to the array index. So this will now be, well, 0 plus 1 is 1. So array index the second time through is going to be 1. It will then increase the size of each of those arrays according to that. So it will go from 0 to 1. Next time through, it'll add 1 to it, it'll be 2, and so on, depending on how many ingredients it finds. And yeah, so that is literally, this bit of code here is literally just defining whereabouts we're going to store this in these arrays. And this section down here is actually going to store the data from the database or the record set into those arrays at the positions that we have just figured out. So mix ingredient array index 0 the first time through will equal the first run through of the returned ingredients. So the first ingredient that gets turned out of the database into this record set will be assigned to mix ind position or array index 0. The next one will be 1, the next one will be 2. And so the associated other bits and pieces will also be in their arrays with the same index. Clear as mud. So now we have looped through all of the ingredients, because that loops, being in a do loop. So we'll loop through all the ingredients, assign them all to arrays. So we have now got all of the data, believe it or not, from the tables for the recipe, and we can start working out, yeah, how much is needed. So one little last thing that I've done for today is I have taken the array index, which is this number here, and when it gets to the last one it will carry on and it will stay whatever the last one was, which handily tells us how many ingredients were brought back. So that means I can store that into another variable called ing count or ingredient count. And yeah, there's not really much point in running this because nothing here is really being displayed to the screen yet. This is all just pulling in data. We haven't done anything with it yet. So we'll better start doing something with it. But that'll be tomorrow. Watching paint dry would be more interesting.